We previously posted a video on the First Civil War in Sudan. But since that war, which lasted for only 17 years, the underlying causes of the conflict have not been resolved. That's why, after only 11 years, the fragile peace fell apart, and the North and South Sudan walked into another bloody and long civil war. Welcome to our video on the Second Sudanese Civil War.
This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video.
In 1956, Sudan gained independence, but what followed was far from an idyllic rise of a new nation, peacefully building itself towards a better, more prosperous future. Sudan was utterly divided along ethnic, religious, economic and political lines between the North and the South, with the latter feeling disenfranchised and discriminated against, which ultimately led to the First Civil War. After 17 years of fighting, both sides were too exhausted, and with a decisive victory not in sight, the North and the South agreed to end the conflict after signing the Addis Ababa Peace Accord in 1972. Although the agreement granted the South autonomy, its grievances remained unresolved. Southern autonomy was very limited, and the North often meddled in its internal affairs, while only meagre investment was made in the South's infrastructure. Another important point of dispute was oil. In 1978, oil was discovered in South Sudan. The problem was that the North wanted to build a pipeline and a refinery there, which the Southerners feared would divert profits and jobs from the South to the North. On top of that, some of the original Anyanya fighters were back in an armed rebellion against the central government as early as 1976, supported by the Derg regime in Ethiopia. The final straw was President Nimeiry's decision to proclaim Sudan an Islamic republic with Sharia law, including in the Christian and animistic South, the autonomy of which was also abolished. This went about as well as one can expect. On May 16, 1983, the Boer garrison in the Upper Nile region of South Sudan mutinied. The rebellion quickly spread to Pibor and Pachala. Just like that, the Second Civil War in Sudan had started. 2 months later, in July, the prominent southern leader of the First Civil War, John Garang, founded the Sudan People's Liberation Army. Over the next couple of years, the SPLA largely operated as a guerrilla movement, successfully employing hit-and-run tactics to drive the Sudanese army out of large swaths of rural areas around Juba, Malakal and Wau, and forcing them to retreat into urban centers. By 1986, the SPLA forces controlled most of western Upper Nile. At this point, the SPLA's biggest foreign supporter was the Marxist Deng regime in Ethiopia. These military setbacks and the horrible economic situation caused widespread protests in the north in 1985, which culminated in Nimeiry getting ousted and Sudan experiencing another brief period of democracy. The new government of Sadiq al-Mahdi, supported by weapons from Iraq and Libya, continued the strategy of trying to defeat the South through military means, even as it pursued peace negotiations that did not lead anywhere. But the SPLA continued conducting successful operations, and by the end of 1988, they had a solid foothold in Bahr al-Ghazal, Equatoria, Upper Nile, Blue Nile, Darfur, and Kordofan, specifically in rural areas, even in North Sudan. The largest city of South Sudan, Juba, was under the SPLA siege. Lands along the borders with Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Zaire, and the Central African Republic were under rebel control, allowing a steady supply of weapons. By the time another coup in Sudan toppled a democratic government in 1989 and brought the National Islamic Front's Omar al-Bashir to power, the SPLA under Garang was overconfident and rejected any concrete peace talks, riding a wave of successive military victories. The Sudanese army struggled to operate effectively in the south due to poor infrastructure, so they decided to enlist the services of Islamicized groups in the south, such as Bagara, Rufa'a, and Rezegite, which often carried out the dirty work for the government. These government-backed militias were guilty of some of the worst atrocities during the war, killing and displacing many civilians, particularly around the oil-rich areas of the south, enabling Western and Chinese oil companies to operate there. At the same time, in 1991, the Derg regime, which supported the SPLA with provisions and delivery of Soviet arms, fell apart. The organization's camps in Ethiopia were eliminated. Another massive blow to South Sudan was the 1991 split within the SPLA. Remember that the South is not ethnically homogeneous, and the largest ethnic group was the Dinka and the Nuer. The former included John Garang, the leader of the SPLA, who was a Dinka. The leader of the rival faction was a Nuer, Riek Machar, who accused Garang of being a dictator and of supporting autonomy for the South rather than outright independence, and who proclaimed the SPLA Nasir faction. Many Nuer fighters of the SPLA joined the Nasir faction. Machar's group took over significant areas in the Upper Nile and Blue Nile provinces, along with taking over several SPLA bases. In 1991, the Nasir faction carried out one of the most gruesome atrocities of the Second Civil War, when they massacred several thousand Dinkas in Bor. In the following years, the Nasir faction collaborated with the Sudanese government against the SPLA, which significantly weakened the rebel force. This paved the way for the Sudanese army to conduct several successful offensives against the SPLA in 1992 to 94, clearing the rebels from all urban centers except Yambio. The areas held by the Nasir faction were not attacked by the government. This does not mean that the SPLA was fully defeated, as despite its major challenges in the first half of the 1990s, it still had considerable strength, as evidenced by a commando attack in Juba in June 1992, and the brief recapture of Tarit in June 1993. But the SPLA split, and the loss of a crucial ally in Ethiopia gave the Sudanese government an advantage during this period of the civil war. However, the Nasir faction soon disintegrated, with Machar eventually creating the South Sudan Defense Forces, openly aligned with Khartoum, while many of his former allies chose the path of becoming local warlords in service of the government. In 1997, this relationship became official, as the sides signed the Khartoum Peace Agreement, in which Machar acted as a representative of South Sudan. The government agreed to allow a referendum on self-determination in the south, but added conditions, which made its implementation highly unlikely. Simultaneously, they kept arming various southern groups and enabling them to fight each other. Throughout the Civil War, this South-on-South war was extremely brutal, with sides routinely using scorched-earth tactics. This eroded the legitimacy of Machar and the other southern anti-SPLA leaders. As a result, many Nuer commanders and soldiers had returned to the SPLA by the end of the decade. Moreover, in an unlikely development, the SPLA managed to forge a tactical alliance with the National Democratic Alliance, a northern movement opposed to the NIF regime, comprising of major parties such as the Democratic Unionist and UMA. This allowed the SPLA to regain momentum and go on an offensive in late 1995. Within the next 2 years, they captured most of the territories lost in 1991. In 1997, Garang launched 2 ambitious offensives with the help of Ugandan, Ethiopian, and Eritrean armies, which at the time were in a state of confrontation with the Sudanese government. The first, called Operation Thunderbolt, was launched in March. The SPLA and its allies quickly captured Kaya and launched an attack on Yei from Juba. Just 4 days after that, Yei fell to the rebels. It was a major victory for Garang, which was followed by the capture of several surrounding towns and supply routes. Simultaneously, large batches of military equipment were captured from fleeing government forces. Another offensive was launched soon after in the southern Blue Nile region, with potentially devastating consequences for Sudan. In spring, the SPLA started moving from their bases in Kurmuk and western Ethiopia, rapidly overrunning several lightly defended Sudanese garrisons. By May, they had Gaisan under control and were within artillery range of Damazin. the key target of the offensive. Why was Damazin important? Because the Damazin Dam provided electricity and water to several northern cities, including Khartoum. The Sudanese army managed to stabilize the situation by late summer, thanks to its air superiority, and to reverse some of the SPLA's gains. More importantly, this was not a guerrilla attack, but an offensive with an organized force into a strategically important area of North Sudan. This meant that a defeat in the war would no longer just mean the loss of the south, but potentially the loss of control or even chaos in the north too. However, by the late 1990s, many oil-rich areas of Sudan were under government or government-aligned militia control and began generating significant revenue for the al-Bashir regime, which predictably led to a significantly increased military spending. In the early 2000s, they pursued a strategy of taking over the oil fields which they did not control in the south. In this period, the Sudanese army and its southern allies managed to take over oil fields in Bentiu, Pariang, and Tharjath, as well as infrastructure connecting them to the north. These attacks were often accompanied by brutality and the displacement of civilians. Additionally, this campaign was politically costly for the government. Some of the targeted oil fields were previously controlled by the pro-government militias, and losing them and associated profits obviously dismayed them. Some to the point of abandoning the government and fighting against it together with the SPLA. The culmination of this process was the peace agreement between two longtime rivals, Garang and Machar, in Nairobi in February 2002. At this point, once again, just like in the First Civil War, neither side had a decisive advantage. The momentum for diplomacy was gaining steam. There had been attempts to bring the sides to the table from the start of the war, but both the Sudanese government and the SPLA refused to engage in substantial talks at various stages of the Second Civil War, believing they had a chance of achieving a decisive military victory. By the early 2000s, there was a significant international pressure on both sides to end the fighting. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, was an African initiative led by Kenya to end the war in Sudan. Another diplomatic track was led by the United States. America supported Sudan at the initial stage of its conflict with the South, which was partly due to the Soviet support for the SPLA as part of the Cold War great power game. However, the introduction of Sharia law and the increasingly authoritarian policies of the Sudanese regime greatly reduced the degree of support provided by the United States. Their relations arguably reached their lowest point when al-Bashir sided with Iraq in the First Gulf War and condemned the US-led intervention. Soon, Sudan was branded a rogue state and a sponsor of international terrorism. This policy changed post 9/11, as al-Bashir offered the United States Sudan's support in the war on terror, seeing it as an opportunity to break the ice and exit isolation. In response, George W. Bush sent his envoy, former Senator John Danforth, to mediate a peace deal between the Sudanese government and the SPLA. But, as it usually is, the warring sides made their final attempts to turn the tide of the war in their favor and increase their leverage in negotiations. This is particularly true for the Sudanese government, which was using its rising oil revenues to purchase fighter jets, attack helicopters, artillery, armored vehicles, and other military supplies from Russia for one last push. In January 2002, the government forces attacked south of Bentiu in the Bahr al-Ghazal and southern Blue Nile regions. Aerial bombardment was followed by artillery shelling and ground attacks by the Sudanese army and its local allies to force the civilian population and the SPLA fighters to flee. During this campaign, the Sudanese army captured notable towns such as Nialdu, Mankien, and Gaisan, and reasserted short-term control over the oil corridors from the south to the north. Even so, it ultimately failed to redraw the strategic situation decisively in favor of the government. The SPLA remained a capable force, controlling swaths of rural territory. This worked in their favor when they managed to cut the government logistics to eastern Equatoria and capture most of this region, including the town of Capoeira, in the spring of 2002. In a nutshell, this had been the story of the Second Sudanese Civil War. For most of the war, the North controlled large urban centers, but the lack of infrastructure and continuous supply lines prevented them from maintaining long-term control over the vast rural areas. The rural areas were the domain of the SPLA and other rebel and militia group activities in the south, which controlled it until the government forces and their southern allies went on the offensive. They would clear out civilians from rural areas brutally to secure logistics, especially for oil transportation, but this would not last for long. The SPLA offensives often managed to dislodge government forces from the rural areas, forcing them back into the cities, which were well defended and beyond the SPLA's relatively limited capabilities. This dynamic prevented any side from gaining a decisive advantage to win the war. Another notable feature of this civil war was its chaotic nature. It was not just the war between the North and the South. There were many other warring sides with different agendas, some of which we discussed, and unfortunately, discussing each and every one in detail would make this video too long. There was the National Democratic Alliance of opposition parties fighting to topple the al-Bashir regime, which allied with the SPLA for this end. There was a Riek Machar-led group split from the SPLA in the south, along with several other organizations like this, which changed their allegiance between the Sudanese government and the SPLA depending on the situation. There were small local warlords who fought on different sides depending on their immediate economic interests. There were southern bandit groups, closely aligned with the government and often doing their dirty work of civilian displacement and ethnic cleansing. Arguably, the worst example of such an atrocity during the Second Civil War was the Darfur genocide. This eastern region of North Sudan had both agricultural black African and semi-nomadic herder Muslim Arab communities. The competing interests of these two communities, along with ethnic and religious differences, had already been a source of tension. In February 2003, the SPLA and the Justice and Equality Movement attacked government forces in Darfur. The government response was all too familiar. Outsourcing their dirty work to the local militia, they armed the local Arabs called the Janjaweed, which, for the next few years, engaged in atrocities that were horrific even by the standards of atrocities in Sudan seen until then. 200 to 300,000 Darfuri people were killed. Millions were displaced. The international community recognized these events as the Darfur genocide. In the end, even such atrocities and spending millions on military equipment did not help the Sudanese government to reassert complete control over the south. And, although the SPLA did not have full control over the south either, it made South Sudan ungovernable for the north. Two civil wars caused by the same reason lasted for almost 40 years in total, out of less than 50 years of independence of Sudan. After spending so many resources on an unwinnable war, on top of millions of military and civilian casualties and refugees, hundreds of destroyed villages and towns with nothing to show for, amidst increasing international pressure, the Sudanese government was pressed to stop the war. After years of negotiations, the Sudanese government and the SPLA finally signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement on January 9, 2005 in Nairobi. South Sudan would have autonomy for the next 6 years, followed by an independence referendum. Oil revenues would be shared evenly between the north and the south. 6 years later, the South Sudanese people overwhelmingly voted for independence, and since then, South Sudan has become an independent republic. But unfortunately, even this did not put an end to violence in Sudan. We'll talk more about the events in Sudan in our future videos, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.